question of transition, I think, from one dynastic order to another is very important, and I think it's being discussed more now than in the past. When I first began to study Iranian history as a graduate student, the literature then, which was still very primitive, this is in the 1980s, saw this movement from Rajaz to Pahlavi as a kind of absolute break. There was that Reza Shah was offering something new to the Iranian state-building project, which had little or nothing to do with anything that had gone before this. And I think we don't see it like that anymore. There has been a lot of work done on the formation in the constitutional period of a discourse, or the strengthening of a pre-existing discourse, which was taken over by the Pahlavi monarchy as it established itself. And I think this is evident in a number of fields. For example, on the question of gender, we see that in the 20s and 30s, the issue of gender was a serious one for the government and for the monarchy and for the prestige of those institutions. But this discourse about gender reform is one that can be dated back to the constitutional period when it was a very lively issue, and even back into the 19th century. So we see this idea of gender reform, which is still quite limited, to do with enhancing some of the rights that women might avail themselves of, and an end to polygamy, especially important female education. This is a key thing in the constitutional period. And again, it's something that has to be battled on and on in the 20s and 30s because there is a great deal of resistance to it. So things like that, things like introducing a civil code which altered the balance of power a little bit between the genders. It wasn't by any means so revolutionary, but it did augur change. And there are other aspects of Pahlavi discourse which have their origins in the constitutional period, because I think we see this now as one, in a way, we talk about the constitutional revolution, but you can also see this as a kind of a way forward, which is being adopted more or less by modernists in general. And I think you can see that in the interwar period in Iran. Again, you see with many of the reforms that Reza Shah introduces, and I look at some of them, these clearly had their origin in earlier periods. For example, in my article on modernism in Iran, which looks at the dangerous classes, you can see, for example, prisons. Now, prisons were seen always as kind of oppressive institutions. But I think Iranian modernists of the constitutional period and the 1920s saw prisons as something else. Prisons were a progressive way of dealing with the problem of crime. So you would no longer have to rely on occasional demonstrations of extreme brutality, which is the way criminals had been dealt with or showcased in order to demonstrate the consequences of crime. You no longer had to do that. You could introduce prisons built on reform agendas. And again, Europe and the Ottoman Empire have a longer history than Iran of this. But in the 1920s, Reza Shah embarks on this very substantial program of prison building. And some people look at this and think, well, this is just another example of repressive policies. But for the Shah and Iranian modernists in general, modern prisons like Qasr this put them in the lead in terms of modernism. This was how Europe, we know about Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon. It's a different conception about how to deal with crime and how to deal with criminals, which has a long history globally and certainly a pre-1921 history in Iran, and which is implemented not as I said, as an instrument of repression, but as a way of demonstrating Iran's membership of the global progressive forces. It was seen as something which would reform the criminal. And this was, again, this was a new idea in Iran, which becomes adopted very rapidly by Iranian modernists, because it wasn't any longer a question of just the criminal, but crime itself. And so the introduction of the prison reform brings with it all sorts of other reforms. So you have to have a fair trial, or some sort of trial. If you're going to condemn people to prison, you need a legal system, you need judges, you need defense counsel, you need police, you need detectives. So this one aspect of reform brings in its train a huge number of transformations, all of which have to be carried out. So I think what we look at now when we look at interwar Iran is something which is immensely complicated and immensely powerful in terms of its impact on people who define themselves as modernists, who wanted Iran to be considered as a sovereign state with the normal functioning state institutions that existed in Europe. And a lot of what goes on in the 20s and 30s is an effort to pursue this agenda with mixed results. But certainly for those people who believed in it, it was a very powerful vision. The notion of Iran, especially these dimensions to do with the greatness of pre-Islamic Iran and the kind of global preeminence of the Achaemenids and their contribution to global civilization and so on. And I think it's one example of Iran's readiness in the interwar period to absorb ideas from everywhere. When we look at these ideas of pre-Islamic Iran and its power and its artistic abilities and so on, as compared to the current existing situation in Iran, which was deemed to be very bad and constant crisis, this is an idea which is usually associated with the late 19th century. But I think actually this idea is even older. And it is largely a European idea. It's if you look at the British writing on Iran, from quite early on, from the very early contacts in the Safavid period, this idea begins to germinate. That the Iran which you see, if you're traveling in the 17th or the 18th or the 19th century, the Iran that you see is the relic of a much greater pre-Islamic civilization. And that this Iran is tarnished or tainted by the conversion to Islam, which was an alien imposition. But I think these ideas are so much embedded in the British way of seeing Iran, which is then picked up by Iranians themselves. But it begins life, if you look at even the correspondence between Queen Elizabeth I and traders in Iran, even that correspondence highlights what was believed to be the case as a result of classical writings, Herodotus and the Bible, the Book of Esther. So I think this is quite interesting, the way that these ideas which became so important to the Pahlavis and which were used to bolster the prestige of the monarchy actually date back to British understandings. Again, you have the discovery, the kind of conclusion in the late 18th century that Persian is a European language. This is, again, it's an entirely European discussion. And the idea, if you say to most Iranians at the time, these ideas would have struck them as completely bizarre. This was not the way the people at the time thought about things. It was only with the empowerment of this discourse by the Pahlavis that it really started to hit home. But it has a much older vintage than it's usually given it's usually seen as being, and it goes back a long way. It's not even the Qajars, it's before that. Well, I think the comparison with Afghanistan is quite interesting because Iran and Afghanistan are so close culturally and sharing a language. And when you look at Afghan attempts at state building, they're very much similar. They're kind of like a rather thin and weak copy of what's going on in Iran. Uh-huh. So they try to do some of the same things. There's an attempt to introduce this military modernization. There's an attempt to bring tribal groups under the control of the government. But the resources that they have to work with in Afghanistan are so few and flimsy. Plus they have to fight a war with the British, which they do at the end of the First World War. So I think they're at a considerable disadvantage when you compare them to the Iranian case. And it is interesting to compare them because you do see the same patterns, albeit much more advanced in the Iranian case. Because we're accustomed to thinking of Iran as very weak in 1921 as a result of the failure of modernization in the 19th century and the impact of the First World War. But when you compare Iran to Afghanistan, you can see how many advantages Iran actually has and is quite successful in mobilizing opinion to support what the Shah wants to do, whereas the obstacles presented to Amanullah in Afghanistan are so much greater. Mm-hmm. And it's quite interesting to see also what happens when this state building process fails. Because in a way we live today, or the Afghans live today, with the consequences of this failure. Because on the one hand, of course, there is a view that the state building process is oppressive and it's harsh and it makes people do things they don't want to do, like join the army. But in the long run, you can see the consequences of not having a state which can do those things. In a country like Afghanistan, it's very serious indeed. Right. And so you have a cycle in Afghanistan of these attempts to follow the state building path, and they are repeatedly sabotaged by internal elements and also from the outside.
Including the tribal element?
Most of all, I think, the tribal elements.
In Afghanistan.
But again, one of the things I wanted to do in my work on the tribes is not to see tribes as monolithic structures.
Right. No, we transition into the tribes section. Yes, okay. Not as monolithic entities, but...
But I was keen to see how different layers of the tribal pyramid responded differently to individual policies. Right. And how much disharmony there was among tribal populations, both within single tribal confederations and between different tribal confederations. And this, of course, one of the things that Reza Shah exploited so successfully, because he's normally, the first Pahlavi period is normally seen as one in which the monarchy defeats the tribes militarily, but it really doesn't. It's not, the problem is not addressed as a military one by the Shah. There are conflicts, but relatively few. The main weapons that the Shah uses are to exploit the internal differences. So, for example, individual tribal leaders, the very top, the Khans, would be turned into MPs, Majlis deputies. They would be given, the Sada Asad is the most famous, ministerial posts. There were opportunities for them to share in the proceeds from the commercialization of agriculture. So land would be sold and the tribal Khans could buy it. So that the old system of seeing the pastures as common property was replaced by individual ownership. And the person who benefited most from this
Oh,
was the Shah himself, I think, first of all, who amassed so much property of all kinds. But the Khans also shared in this. So they were second, if you like, after the Shah in terms of driving this transformation, which did have a very negative impact on the life of the nomadic tribes, those groups. And they were not all nomadic, by the way.
Very interesting.